designs. And second, we have created a framework for how to design these alternative rate designs that we hope you will be able to take back and apply in your work in both designing new rates and reviewing existing and proposed rates. So with that, go ahead and introduce what we're going to go through today. So we'll kick off with just a little bit of a discussion around what's driving this need for better rate design. What are kind of the trends in the industry that are leading us to having this discussion here today? Second, we'll go through some of the findings from our recent report on both demand charge rates and time-based rates. And we'll wrap up talking about how we can apply those findings going forward here. And we'll leave time at the end for Q&A. At the same time, if you have any clarifying questions that you'd like to ask during the presentation, please go ahead and enter those into the GoToMeeting question box on your control panel. And we'll be monitoring those and take a couple of breaks during the presentation to answer any clarifying questions that come up. But more kind of open-ended or discussion-oriented questions, please hold those for the end, and we will talk about them then. So before we dive right into it, I'm going to hand it over to Dan to just say a couple words about RMI and eLab here.
Great, thank you, James. So yeah, just a few words. I think many folks on the line are probably familiar with RMI as well as with the Electricity Innovation Lab. But just to orient us all, RMI is a nonprofit founded in 1982, and we are headquartered here in Colorado. And we're founded here in Colorado, although we now have offices in 7 cities around the world. And we work across sectors to develop market-based approaches and solutions to solving the most pressing energy challenges that we face. And that, of course, includes our electricity work and also our buildings efficiency work, transportation and mobility, as well as industrial practices and some work in a couple international arenas. For at least the last 4 or 5 years, the Electricity Innovation Lab has really been the cornerstone of our electricity activities. And through eLab, we convene leading stakeholders across the U.S. power system to work collaboratively on the major challenges that the sector faces, both taking the technological opportunities and challenges that the sector faces and thinking through the institutional and organizational and regulatory barriers that exist and how we can unlock those to support the change that we seek. Part of eLab is really research in collaboration with our network of members. For example, I think just yesterday we released our report, Electric Vehicles as a Distributed Energy Resource. This was previewed in a recent webinar, and that report is now available on our website for those that want to go and download it. The work we're presenting here today is not strictly an eLab presentation. It comes out of kind of the broader RMI research and collaboration activities, but of course it's highly applicable to eLab's work in electricity sector reform. And just to put this work in context a little bit, we've been working on rate design questions for many years. In the last few, this really built upon a report we released in 2014, Rate Design for the Distribution Edge, in which we kind of described the framework and the needs that are forcing these changes to rate reforms and the opportunities available there. Last year, our colleagues released the report, The Economics of Demand Flexibility, and this report reviewed the opportunities available from load shifting and dynamic load management, particularly with a lens on rate designs that can enable that value proposition. And that leads us to where we are today with last month's publication, a review of alternative rate designs, in which we really took some time to do some significant research and a meta-analysis of reports and experience with these alternative rate designs to help identify best practices and provide a framework for assessing those.
All right, thanks, Dan. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and just dive right into it. So what's driving us to be where we are here today? I have a feeling that this is going to sound familiar to a lot of folks that are on the call here. These are trends that have really been well publicized and at the forefront of the industry on multiple fronts, but In particular, I want to highlight three here. The diversity of customer load profiles is just kind of increasing. There's been some really interesting work OPower and others have done to kind of unbundle this and really understand, that customers are just becoming more diverse in terms of how they use electricity. Secondly, new technology is increasing capabilities. I think we're all familiar at this point with the ubiquitous Nest thermostat, which is just one example of many different types of technologies that are coming onto the market that are really changing the way that customers can use electricity. And lastly, electricity demand overall is starting to flatten out, both for residential customers and for customers at large. As a result, this has implications on rate design. Current price signals are really kind of inadequate to incentivize or convey the messages that are needed for customers to be able to respond to these changing patterns and the changing costs associated with them. Related to that, the existing rate design toolkit, which really revolves around kind of simple fixed charges and flat volumetric rates, is pretty limited in being able to send those better price signals. And lastly, there's growing misalignment between costs and rates. This is kind of related to the above 2 points, but really the fact that the toolkit is limited limits the ability to send price signals that are more effective. So as we think about how to do something different with rate design, what we really need to come back to is a set of rate design objectives. These are nothing new. What we did in our recent report, though, was kind of pull together some of the foundational rate design principles that folks like Bondbright and then Garfield and Lovejoy put forth, and integrated them with some kind of 21st century revisions that both RMI, the Regulatory Assistance Project, the New York Public Service Commission, and their REV proceeding had brought out. And this really boils down to these key guidelines, starting with enabling cost recovery, which is kind of at the basis of any rate design, but also moving to include cost causation, encouraging customer decision-making and economic efficiency, supporting desired outcomes, which I'll talk a little more in a second, providing transparency around the costs and the reasons why prices are what they are, providing fair value both for services to the grid and services from the grid, a customer orientation, so kind of around simplicity, maintaining stability in terms of bills and rates, and ensuring access to all customers, including low-income customers, to the electricity system, and gradualism, so not changing too much too quickly. In particular, I want to highlight on desired outcomes. So this could include a variety of things. A few that we'll highlight here and that we've looked at in detail in our report are around customer acceptance, so enrollment and retention, for instance, total energy consumption, and reducing total peak demand on the system, so leading toward lower cost overall. And lastly, I also want to call out, so another thing that really struck us as we were doing this research is how frequently cost recovery is really the end-all be-all of rate design. And cost recovery is obviously important. It's important for many, many reasons. But at the same time, we need to ensure going forward that these other objectives, which are equally important, are put on equal footing with cost recovery in the design and execution of rates.
And I think this is just a key point that we like to really think about and emphasize with this work. As we undertook the research, thinking through the whole suite of objectives that are often given attention in rate design efforts, but as James said, it is too often reduced to cost recovery. But in fact, we don't see these objectives as mutually exclusive. And in fact, by giving broader attention to the full suite, you can actually have a more robust solution that's in the service to societal needs, including ultimately cost reductions and system efficiency. So that's the lens with which we looked at this research.
Great points. Thanks, Dan. So then going forward, with that set of objectives and principles in mind, how can we start to think about new rates? In our 2014 report, we really broke this down to rate design that can change along 3 different continuums. First of all, the attribute continuum, which is really around how bundled or unbundled rates are. The temporal continuum, so how often do they change, or do they change at all by time? And finally, the locational continuum. So are they the same for an entire utility territory, for instance, or do they vary by, house to house or circuit to circuit on the distribution system? From that, there are a number of different approaches available. So we're going to talk about a couple of those today, but it's important to keep in mind that, this is really a developing space and there are a number of options that are available. So just to orient you, here we have these three sliders where on the left side we kind of have a low level for that particular continuum, and on the right side we have a high level. Today's block pricing being kind of the benchmark and very low level on all sides. There's also near-term possibilities that have been proposed and folks are probably familiar with, at least to a certain degree. So time of use pricing obviously has been around for quite a while and increases temporal granularity. Energy and capacity pricing or demand charges are a way to unbundle different components. Distribution hotspot credits are something that has been talked about a little bit as a way to get at locational granularity. And in addition to those, there's a variety of longer term, more sophisticated possibilities that are potentially available. So things like real-time pricing, which have been tested out a little bit, but really begin to further increase temporal granularity. Additional attribute-based pricing and distribution locational marginal pricing, way at one end of the spectrum, probably down the road a little bit, but it's important to keep in mind that these things are out there. And the transition of rates is really something that's going to happen over time as we move toward these more sophisticated possibilities. So that being said, these are being proposed today across the country, everywhere from California to Massachusetts, Illinois, New York, and the Reforming the Energy Vision proceeding, of course. Folks are proposing and considering new approaches to rate design. California recently going to move toward default time of use rates. Arizona Public Service and Xcel Energy in the news recently proposing new demand charges. This is happening, it's happening today. And it's important that we are paying attention to this and that we really understand what these new rates mean and whether they are optimally achieving these different objectives that we have laid out. So with that in mind, our research is really focused on the two most prominent types of alternative rates. First of all, time-based rates, which includes time of use rates. And second of all, demand charge rates, which are kind of coming more and more into the picture for mass market customers as utilities are proposing these. With our research, we asked a series of questions. First of all, what design choices are most important for determining whether a given rate is going to achieve the various objectives that are out there? And then what magnitude of impact can they actually have? What might prevent them from being successfully implemented? And after looking at all that, what are the big knowledge gaps that are out there? So what we've tried to do and what we're going to present a little bit on today is develop a structure for how you can evaluate rates, both for designing them and evaluating existing or proposed ones. And within that, the major design choices and options that are important to take into account. And along with that, the choices that are really most important. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about specific areas where we see big gaps and where further study is needed. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and dive right into demand charges and some of our findings there. Before I go too deep, I think it's worth just reflecting that what we really came to is a conclusion that there's two distinct types of demand charges. First of all, what are called ex post demand charges. These are what have been proposed recently and what Arizona Public Service has used for years, which is based on demand in the previous month. So it's an after the fact measurement demand. There are also demand charges out there, and these have been used more frequently in Europe, Indonesia, and to a limited extent in the US, City of Burbank being one example. And what these do is they actually are kind of pre-selected, so forward-looking, selecting kind of a maximum level of service. So again, just keep these in mind that these are kind of two different approaches in general to demand charge structures. We're going to focus mostly on the ex post because that's what's most relevant in the industry right now, but These are two different types that are out there. So today there's a pretty small number of utilities in the US that are offering residential demand charges. The number is on the order of 25. These are all opt-in with a couple of exceptions. There's a co-op in South Carolina and another in Kansas that have either a mandatory or a default demand charge that have been introduced recently, but the rest of these today, at least, are all opt-in. And for the most part, these have been designed around cost recovery rather than around customer response and other rate design objectives. And the fact that there are a relatively small number of these existing demand charges really leads us to what we were a little bit frustrated with in our study, which was that we found that there just isn't a whole lot of information out there in terms of how demand charges affect customer behavior and desired outcomes. So, it's really not clear how they affect energy efficiency and customers' total energy consumption. And it's not clear how they affect customers' peak load, which is one of the things that's talked about frequently with demand charges, is that in theory, they should incentivize customers to reduce their peak load. There's really no evidence out there. There's a couple of studies from the 1970s and another from Norway, none of which I think you could argue are really that applicable to customers in the US today. There is some evidence of customers accepting or enrolling in these rates. For instance, Arizona Public Service has on the order of 10 or 11% of their customers that are enrolled in demand charge. But again, this is a pretty limited sample size and there isn't a whole lot of information out there. And because of that, there are a lot of open questions and concerns around demand charges. You kind of have two camps. You have the pro-demand charge camp, oftentimes that includes utilities that are proposing demand charges, and the anti-demand charge or the concerned about demand charge camp. And there are legitimate considerations on both sides. So, folks on the pro side might argue, that demand charges really help with cost recovery better than other approaches can, and they send price signals that reflect the costs on the system. At the same time, folks are concerned that customers are not going to really understand how to manage their power demand. We've been telling them for decades to manage their energy, and now we're asking them to do something different. Are they going to do it or not? There's also concerns that financial impacts on customers might actually be punitive or regressive, and that demand charges could limit the incentive for energy efficiency. So right now we're in a little bit of a stalemate, right? There isn't evidence to prove it one way or another. So going forward, we need to think about what's needed to prove whether these are a viable option. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end and when we talk about applying these, but this is a big concern around demand charges right now. So one of the things that we developed in the report is a framework for how you can break apart a demand charge rate and really start to understand the design choices that make it up. We've grouped those design choices into three categories: pricing foundation, structure, and implementation. So within pricing foundation, you have a design choice around the cost components and allocation that go into the charge. Within structure, you have choices around the peak coincidence of the charge, whether it is or isn't coincident with peak. The measurement interval, so how long is that meter taking a reading of the demand? How many peak incidents are included in the demand charge? Is it seasonally differentiated? Does it have one season, 2 seasons? Is there a ratchet involved, which kind of brings past use into the calculation of a current charge? And within implementation, you also have choices around the enrollment method. Is it opt-in, opt-out, default, mandatory? And is there any enabling technology included? So is there something like a thermostat, like a Nest or something like that that's included with the rate? These in detail in the report, A Review of Alternative Rate Designs. Today, for the sake of time, I'm just going to briefly talk about 2 of these, which are really interesting and really, I think, kind of controversial or a little bit, it's unclear what the best choice really is here. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but I would refer you to the report itself for more information on both these and all of these design choices. So quickly, the cost components aspect of the pricing foundation category. This is really a question of what what amount of cost are you recovering through a demand charge versus other components of a rate like fixed charges or volumetric charges. And there's different schools of thought about how to do this and some important considerations. First of all, are the costs that you're considering recovering through the demand charge actually driven by customer peak demand? This would include things like capacity costs on the distribution system, perhaps. Secondly, is the cost component best recovered through demand, or is it better recovered through volumetric or customer charges? Putting things into a demand charge might help hedge against uncertainty a little bit, but it might also make the rate a little bit less actionable. So those three schools of thought really come down to what we've called narrow demand charges, broad demand charges, and extensive demand charges. As the name implies, narrow kind of includes a very narrow scope of cost, really things that are limited to an individual customer or individual customer building, like the service drop-in line transformer. Broad demand charges go a little bit further, including like distribution capacity costs. And then extensive demand charges, which are what we've seen proposed frequently, actually include a lot of different costs around system infrastructure for peak demand, including everything all the way up to transmission and generation costs. And the other dimension that I mentioned around peak coincidence. So this is another important one because it really affects when the customer's demand is measured and ultimately whether it's being measured at a time where that demand is affecting system cost. A lot of existing demand charges are actually based on customers' non-coincident peak demand, which is the demand at any time during a billing period, so any time during the month. It could be at 3 in the morning, it could be at 1 in the afternoon. On the other hand, coincident peak really tries to target measuring the demand at the time when the system at some level is at its highest usage. So there's a couple of questions that factor into this one. First of all, whether that timing of the peak is determined ahead of time, whether it's a forecast, or whether it's after the fact, so where the customer doesn't actually know when the peak is going to occur, they're just charged afterwards. And also what level of the system determines the peak. So is it the distribution system peak? Is it the bulk system peak? There are arguments to be made for either, and it, again, kind of relates back to the cost component. So if you're including only distribution system costs, then that's probably the peak that's most relevant there. And just to illustrate this, looking at this diagram, so this illustrates the bulk system loading in light blue, the distribution system loading in green, and customer loading in red. And what we're showing here is how different the demand reading could be depending on which of those approaches are used. So if it's the bulk system peak and a peak coincident demand charge, it would be up there around a little over 5. If it's the distribution peak, it's at 4, and if it's a non-coincident peak, then it would be over measured at 8 p.m. Just a little under or 2.
So as we kind of come to the end of the demand charge section, I just want to remind folks that we are taking clarifying questions at points throughout the presentation. We've received a couple questions, one of which I'll pose now. I think it actually came in a little earlier, but it does apply to the questions around cost components and recovery. The question is, when you analyze for cost recovery, should one look separately at genuine system costs versus a portion of costs due to past quote-unquote bad decisions? And the example is provided of the California energy crisis repercussions. I'll offer preliminary thoughts on that question and invite my co-authors to do the same. I think really I'll just say that our report specifically doesn't consider good versus bad decisions or the questions of stranded assets. We're really kind of thinking about the rate design choices themselves to recover identified system costs. But there is obviously a very important consideration in the electricity system, especially in the modern times of the evolution that's undergoing on the system for what is prudent investment and really then how to consider past investments and the infrastructure that's in place. I'll just say that RMI is undertaking other research by some of our colleagues to think about capital expenditure planning and addressing exactly some of these questions that we hope to release in the not too distant future.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, and I think I would just echo your response in terms of the distinction between kind of past stranded asset costs and bad decisions versus the actual rate design itself. I think that decision around whether or not utilities should recover those costs is really a separate issue. Cool. So yeah, like Dan said, please ask clarifying questions through the GoToMeeting window. Um, and
Yeah, before we move on, I'll just take one more question, then we'll be sure to move ahead. But the question just came in on slide 20. Were the ex-ante coincident peaks chosen based on anticipated distribution and bulk system peaks?
right, that's kind of a sub-design choice, I guess, between or within that. So it could be chosen on anticipated or forecasted system conditions. It could also be chosen based on historical system conditions. There's probably a correlation between the two. In this example, I think that this would be based on, in some ways, kind of actual or after the fact measurement. That said, this is really like another design choice that needs to be made.
And I think it also points to what we hope the value of this research and the framework provides is starting to bucket some of the major dimensions for consideration, and then by providing what we hope is kind of a common framework and some level setting on these components, you can then dig deeper into the specific implications that some of these questions are starting to raise.
Yeah. Great. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Aman to talk a little bit about our findings on time-based rates.
Thank you, James. So for our report, we reviewed all existing literature to define a framework and to evaluate design choices and impacts for time-based rate design. In this section, we'll again provide a sneak preview of our extensive rate research for such rates. We'd consider our efforts successful if this report will serve as your primary tool to evaluate time-based rate proposals and not just a tool to prop up the broken chair in your office. So what we found in our research was that the depth and scope of experience available for time-based rates is much more compared to demand charge rates. Based on EIA data alone, utilities in all states but Rhode Island currently offer time-based rates. The impact of these rates on key outcomes such as customer acceptance, peak demand, and total energy consumption have also been extensively studied in literature. So despite wide prevalence, enrollment in most time-based rates remains very low. As you can see, in nearly 38 states, enrollment is below 2%. Baltimore and Maryland stand out. Maryland and Delaware stand out with higher than 50% enrollment. BG&E's Smart Energy Rewards program has managed to enroll nearly 500,000 customers as of now, and they have plans to enroll at least another 500,000 soon. As one of the outcomes that is of particular interest right through this report, we hope to shed some more light on the reasons for the variation in enrollment. It's also important to note that most of these programs have also been offered on an opt-in basis. But as more states, including California and Massachusetts, explore moving towards time-based rates, we will see higher enrollment in the future. Now, time-based rates come in all different flavors. At their core, they're built upon one of three base structures. The flat volumetric rate is the vanilla base structure with time of use and real-time pricing being the more complex options. To increase rate sophistication, utilities have often included other modifications without moving to a more complex base structure. Think of these as cheese stuffing in pizza crust or sprinkles and caramel on ice cream. If you have a sweet tooth, allow me to come back to these modifications in the next slide, but we can talk more about those. Now, putting those base structures and modifications together results in a number of permutations that we map here. Altering base structures and including modifications adds two-dimensional sophistication to rates as we move from flat volumetric rates on the lower left corner to real-time prices on the right corner. The first dimension is that of temporal granularity, which indicates the number of different price levels a customer might experience within a day. The second dimension looks at price uncertainty, that is, how far in advance do customers know what price at a given time of the day will be. Now, coming back to the modifications to the base structure, critical peak modifications encapsulate higher prices or rebates for a number of days each year. These prices are often predetermined. Again, go back to PG&E's Smart Energy Awards program. Variable peak, where prices during a critical event can also vary. Oklahoma Gas and Electric's Smart Hours program, and they also had a pilot before, experimented with such rates. In a flexible duration modification, the duration of the peak event can also vary. Now, I'm starting to think about ice cream again. I mean, what flavor you choose can ultimately affect some key outcomes, including your happiness. For time-based rates, these outcomes and their causality have been oft studied. In our review, we noticed that time-based rates can lead to a reduction in peak load ranging from 0 to close to 50%. Likewise, a reduction in total energy consumption can vary between 0 and 10%. There's fairly high variance in enrollment numbers depending on whether the program is often offered on an opt-in or an opt-out basis. However, what's interesting to note is the seemingly wide variance in outcomes. This variation we see is dependent on various different design choices, with some affecting outcomes more than others. But apart from these design choices, it's also important to note that marketing and customer education can also improve outcomes significantly. In this slide, we start to look at these design choices in more detail. Similar to the framework that we provided for demand charges, design choices for time-based rates can also be classified in three broad categories, including pricing foundation, structure, and implementation. While some of these dimensions, including those under pricing foundation and implementation categories, remains in those for demand. New ones include peak off-peak price ratio, or what we call the POP ratio, which is pretty self-explanatory. But apart from that, there's also peak period duration, which affects how well customers are able to move their consumption from one pricing period to the other. Peak period frequency, which could be daily for basic TOU rates or restricted to a certain number of days for modified time-based rates. And financial mechanism, which speaks to the incentive or disincentive that customers are offered depending on the value of their usage at a certain point in time. Out of all the 9 dimensions that are studied in the report, we will discuss a couple of more interesting choices today, the peak to off-peak price ratio and the financial mechanism. Now, the peak to off-peak price ratio is possibly one of the most significant design choices in this framework, especially because of the significant impact that has on peak reduction. But it's interesting to note that the POP ratio itself is a function of 4 other natural dimensions that we outlined on the previous slide. As you think about designing these rates and thinking about what POP ratio should be used, it's important to target a specific POP ratio that could result in desirable outcomes. But while doing so, we must also aim to constrain other input dimensions within acceptable ranges, such that they can elicit desired customer response.
Aman, I think this is also really, as you've as you've demonstrated, just a key design consideration, and it has a lot of implications. As shown here, there's other dimensions that interact with the pop ratio, and I think one of the more interesting things to emerge from our research was examples of very low pop ratios. As shown in the slide, we find examples that are virtually one-to-one ratios, so almost non-existent. And what it also highlighted is instances where the quote-unquote on-peak period was extraordinarily long, more than 12 hours in some cases. So as a result, with very long on-peak prices periods, you had a on-peak price that was only marginally above the base price. And then our conclusion from those examples, you result in an on-peak period that's virtually unusable or meaningless to the customer. It's I think a potentially or perhaps obvious point, but one that's critical, and we hope get attention in rate design efforts going forward.
Great, thank you, Dan. So just trying to kind of study the impact that pop ratios can have on the final outcomes, especially peak reduction, as that has been one of the most often studied impacts. So what we notice from previous studies as well is that higher pop ratios tend to produce much larger reductions in on-peak consumption. Modified time-based rates here in blue, which apply peak prices to shorter time intervals, have higher pop ratio values and consequently higher peak reduction as well. However, much lesser evidence is available to definitively evaluate the impact of pop ratio on total energy consumption. It can be postulated that higher pop ratio increases the reduction in total energy consumption. Sacramento Municipal Utility District's pilot as a part of DOE's consumer behavior studies a couple of years back compared the two and found that customers on CPP rates with in-home displays reduced consumption by 3.5% compared to 1% for those on time fuse rates. Moving on, the other design choice that we will cover today for time-based rate financial mechanism, which addresses how customers are provided incentives or disincentives, change usage, based on costs and benefits to the grid. Again, this is very interesting to the popularity that it has gained recently across the country. The first option is price-based, where volumetric rates for consumption are increased or decreased for certain hours of the day. Rebates, on the other hand, provide financial rewards to customers for reducing consumption. I'm going back to Baltimore's example now. Now, when it comes to comparing rebates and, when it comes to comparing rebates against price-based rates, a few important challenges need to be considered. First, how will a customer's baseline consumption be calculated? Now, since rebates are usually offered for reducing consumption below baseline levels, this is a critical consideration. As we might remember from the news from a couple of years back in Camden Yards in Maryland, the stadium manager would often turn on the stadium lights to inflate baseline consumption to get higher payouts. So again, this is something that we might want to think about. The second important challenge is whether rebates exacerbate cross-subsidies by awarding customers for serendipitous reduction in consumption. And again, this could be a heavy use customer who could be accidentally provided a huge rebate for just being away from home during a peak event. And lastly, there are some questions around the persistence of peak reduction impacts from rebate programs. Now, apart from price-based rates, other mechanisms are also being tried out, including competitions and rewards, and other programs based on moral suasion. There is limited yet increasing application of such mechanisms in the industry, but some results suggest that these could be highly impactful and cost-effective. Moving on, the evidence from a number of studies, if we are to focus just on rebates and price-based rates for now, suggests that both these programs are equally accepted by customers. Price-based rates tend to be much more effective at reducing peak and total energy consumption. What we note is that average peak reduction from critical peak pricing rates is about 21% compared to 11% for rebate type rates. Now, while there is lesser evidence to compare, so while there's lesser evidence to compare the reduction in energy consumption for price-based and rebate rates, it's postulated that rebates result in total lower reduction and may also reduce customers' incentives to invest in energy efficiency. But we do know that, despite all these drawbacks, that rebates might be useful in some settings. To improve efficacy, they may even be targeted at some customer segments, such as those who responded to incentive-style mechanisms or possibly even lower income groups. Some other academicians have also proposed modifications to rebates, notably Severin Bodenstein has suggested a few that might be considered. So summing it all up, we think that this framework provides a useful tool to analyze the efficacy and impacts of various design choices. Oklahoma gas electric modified time-based rates with CP and BP modifications, and SMUD's basic TOU rates show how these design principles can be carefully balanced. While we have seen that the focus of rates has been mostly on cost recovery, these successful rate programs also account for customer needs and responsiveness. Again, going back to Dan's points, the peak period, the on-peak price ratio, the peak to off-peak price ratio are well within acceptable ranges that enable customers to respond by changing their consumption patterns. Again, this points to how specific design choices individually and in combination affect final outcomes. As a result of these design choices and active customer education, both of these achieve fairly high peak reduction. I mean, even though at 6%, the peak reduction from SMUD's default TOU may appear small, but it must be noted that it's pretty high for a default rate program that includes a mix of both highly and less engaged customers.
Pausing here as we kind of reach the end of the time-based rate discussion, just a moment for questions. We've received at least one clarifying question, a few others that I think we might hold until the end of the remainder of the presentation. But the question that's come in is, are the POP ratios comparing the bundled rate or just the generation component? Aman or James, would you like to take that?
So the programs that we looked at were looking at the bundled rates. That's the final rate that the customers saw. But we do understand that some utility programs have separate components for delivery and supply. In those cases as well, it's important to look at POP ratios which the customer sees, because that's the rate that customers will respond to. So I guess what you want to do is base an estimate of peak reduction on the total bundle rate.
Yeah, Man, you make a critical point there about thinking this through as far as what the customer sees is a key lens that we wanted to put on all of this, because ultimately driving toward the objectives that James highlighted at the beginning, including peak reduction, total energy reduction, and customer response, it's really about what the customer is seeing. And of course, embedding within that cost recovery and other objectives are critical and necessary, but things like the POP ratio and even the interval or the length, the duration of an on-peak period, we really wanted to consider that. How does it appear to the customer, and how does that support or enable them to make a decision?
Great, thanks, Aman. So now we'll close this up by quickly thinking about how we can actually apply these findings and frameworks that we have presented here. So first of all, I think it's worth noting that while we all recognize how important the design of a rate is, not all of the proposals and existing rates that are out there necessarily follow best practices or necessarily make the design choices that will best enable the rate to achieve the rate design objectives that commissions, utilities, and customers would like to see. On the demand charge side, there's a couple of particular design choices to highlight. So cost components and peak coincidence are really key to determining whether the rate sends accurate price signals of system costs to customers. At the same time, there's other dimensions, including measurement interval, number of periods, the ratchet mechanism, if there is one, which will influence how well customers are able to respond to it. On the time-based rate side, and again, I just want to reiterate, all of the design choices that we laid forward are important. This is just kind of highlighting a few for you guys to take away here. So on time-based rates, the financial mechanism that's used, the peak-to-off-peak price ratio, and the peak period duration are all really important for determining whether the rate enables customer response or not, as well as whether it reflects the actual time-varying system cost that it's meant to reflect. So going forward, what can we do with this? First of all, I think we've presented these frameworks both for time-based rates and for demand charges. And we would love to see these used by folks as they are designing new rates and as they're reviewing existing rates and proposed rates. For example, we recently wrote a blog, or actually Aman and Dan wrote a blog, doing just that, using the design framework for demand charges to better understand a proposal that Xcel Energy here in Colorado recently put forward. So what, in part of why this was interesting is because that Xcel proposal is actually it's kind of quirky. There's some weird things going on in it. It consists of a couple of different kind of fixed charges or customer charges, what they call a grid use charge, a demand charge, and an energy charge, or a volumetric rate. In particular, this grid use charge is kind of interesting. So the demand charge obviously is as it sounds, it's a demand charge. It's easily fits into our framework. It's an ex post charge that includes an extensive number of costs. It's coincident with peak, with a 60-minute measurement interval, and so on. The grid use charge, on the other hand, it's a flat number, but it's based on a rolling average of 12-month consumption. And we feel like this actually fits really well into the demand charge framework that we've proposed. So it's a demand charge with a really long measurement interval of a month, and a ratchet that essentially looks at a 12-month average of past usage. So you're kind of locked into your existing month's usage for about a year going forward under this rate.
Yeah, and I think it was a really interesting exercise for us to go through, to having just done this research, then look at a active proposal, in this case by Xcel here in Colorado. And a couple interesting things that emerge here is that grid use charge is quite novel, not something seen too often elsewhere, but this 12-month rolling average of kilowatt-hour usage, as we understand it, is intended to do what fixed or demand charges sometimes are designed for, which is to recover grid expenses, distribution system expenses. And what Xcel has done by putting in this tiered structure is attach it to customers' inclining use of the system. But as we point out in the report, a long measurement interval, as this does, of 1 month, or even the 12-month average that we're categorizing as a ratchet mechanism, has the effect of dampening customers' actual ability to reduce that charge, due to it taking a full year for past high usage to roll off. So while it provides stability potentially for the customer, it also reduces the ability of customers to respond and adjust in response to what might be high rates and high prices. The other thing to note here on the left side with this RDTOU price is, as a result of a pretty significant grid use charge and move toward demand charges, the energy charge is extraordinarily low, less than 1 penny per kilowatt hour. And so with proposals like this, it's critical to think about what that translates to as far as signals for energy conservation, for energy management, and as well as that begins to translate to what the incentives are and the bill impacts from things like not only energy efficiency, but also solar and net metering, as those are coupled with rate designs.
Yeah, so this is just one example of how this framework or these frameworks can be applied. Again, hopefully this is something that you all will find useful in your work going forward and can use this to kind of unpack some of these proposals and existing rates. So in addition to that, though, we highlighted some of our findings around the empirical evidence that's out there on these rate designs and the kinds of impacts that they can have. And as we mentioned, empirical evidence is really important to being able to understand whether the rates have the impacts that we want them to, which can help to address stakeholder concerns around the rates. In particular, on the demand charges front, just to reiterate, there's not much empirical evidence that's available. And what's really needed going forward is more of it, frankly. On the time-based rate side, there's more empirical evidence that's out there. At the same time, we, as an industry, can continue to improve our understanding of the impacts. But right now, there's plenty of evidence out there, and it's pretty safe to say that, if well-designed, time-based rates are safe to move forward with on a broader rollout. So moving forward, what can we do? On demand charges, really what's needed is conducting pilots and studies to gain an understanding of the impacts. SMUD, as Aman mentioned, has a great example that can be followed in terms of how to do this in a very systematic and robust way. And then publicly report those findings and the data associated with them to help stakeholders and the public understand what these impacts are. On time-based rates, moving forward with using some of this knowledge around good design choices to improve existing opt-in rates, as well as testing and implementing new opt-out time-based rates, is a great go with going forward. And at the same time, continuing to publicly report findings and data from those. Finally, hopefully there are at least a few researchers or folks in the crowd that are interested in potentially doing additional research on this. We wanted to highlight some of what we saw, where we saw key gaps in the industry knowledge on these fronts. And these would be great areas for folks to address going forward. And I'll just run through this list. So evaluating the impacts of rates, both time-based rates and demand charge rates, on total energy consumption, are essentially identifying how customers do or don't conserve energy and respond to the rate. Second, identifying the impact of demand charges on really all of the key outcomes that we care about. As I mentioned earlier, there just isn't much evidence out there. Understanding the impact of combining the two, of combining a time-based rate with a demand charge rate, which folks have tried in practice, but there hasn't been any real study of. Improving the understanding of the relationship between rates and technology, so continuing to better understand how existing technologies like programmable thermostats, as well as new technologies that are coming onto the market, can enable or unlock customer response or not. Clarifying the methods for including and allocating cost components. This is one of those areas where it's incredibly dense and incredibly difficult to get into even a rate case and understand how a utility allocated costs and why. So particularly for utilities going forward, being sure to fully and clearly articulate why and how they're making those choices. And finally, understanding the impact of these rates on low-income customers, which is a major issue and is also a major gap in terms of data. So data both on low-income customer usage and then on how these rates, how they might respond to these rates or how the rates might affect them. So with that, we'll go ahead and transition to questions. We have the link to the report here, so folks that haven't seen the report or review of alternative rate designs, please go and check that out. But with that, we'll go ahead and transition to some of the questions that have come in.
All right, so a few questions have come in, and we'll kind of curate as more come in. We'll try to answer those that we can. But the first pretty straightforward question is, do attendees receive a copy of this PowerPoint presentation for reference later on? This presentation will be available on the RMI YouTube channel, so you can watch both the presentation and our audio with that. I think that should be available within the week. I would also just encourage all this work is available in the report itself, so I would encourage interested listeners just to go ahead and download the report. You can get this material and much more in the report. Another question that came in a little bit earlier that we've been holding I think this is in reference to the time-based rate structures, those base structures and modifications. Was any consideration given to rate structures where demand levels interact with electricity pricing? For example, the use of energy price tiers or blocks where a number of kilowatt hours in each block or tier is based on a customer's ex-post billing. I'm understanding this to be really a question about inclining block rates, as we've seen in California and a few other places employed. I would immediately offer those inclining block rates absolutely are an important one design consideration, and I think we would group those under that flat volumetric base structure, understanding it is with the inclining block structure at which the price goes up as you consume more in a given month, but it is a flat structure on which other modifications can be built. That's how we've considered it. I'd also point to the Xcel example that we shared. That grid use charge uses what is also an inclining block structure, but as applied to that monthly consumption averaged over the full year. So there's another example where they're doing that ex post assessment of prices according to how much energy is being consumed. There's also a question that came in as a check. I think this is also in response to the Xcel example. As a check on utility accuracy of calculating fixed charges, doesn't an energy charge of 1 cent per kilowatt hour provide evidence of miscalculation? That is this below wholesale energy costs?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's one of the things that struck us as we were looking at this rate and seeing that number. You know, to be honest, it's really difficult to tell at this point whether it is a miscalculation or whether they have moved some of those energy costs into one of the other charges. It seems likely that the latter is the case, but it's hard to say at this stage of the process based on the information that, at least the information that I've seen.
Yeah, I think what it points to for me is that a lot of the costs have now been moved into the combination of that demand charge and the grid use charge. So what it is in particular is what we've called an extensive demand charge. That's really attempting to recover a broad swath of costs, not just distribution costs that are strictly fixed at the customer level, but really moving up the chain to the distribution and the transmission and perhaps even the generation level of the system.
And I think just tying it back to what I spoke a little bit about in the cost components design choice, you know, there's a key consideration here, which is, are costs that are included in a demand charge, are they actually related to a customer's peak demand? Or, you know, in this case, in the case of energy costs, are they related to energy usage and would be more appropriately recovered through a volumetric charge? So great question on that, though.
Right. And in I think we're kind of at the wire here. Maybe we'll take one more question and then wrap up. But I'm seeing a couple questions come in around net metering. One is, for net metering rate design alternatives, are there recommended frameworks that put particular emphasis on demand charges or time of use charges for rate designs that strive to balance cost recovery and renewable energy adoption? There's another question. Thinking of net metering, does your research provide any understanding regarding how to price utility services where a customer might be net zero in terms of their net use, but perhaps they've moved significant amounts of energy through their meter, so those inbound and outbound flows?
Yeah, so with the research and with the report that this presentation was largely based on, we were really trying to focus on rates for consumption first and foremost. The way that those interact with net metering, you know, assuming that net metering is left alone and not changed, is going to be much the same as today. At the same time, you know, net metering is part of a kind of a separate and larger conversation around how to best price and value the benefits and costs that distributed resources provide to the system. And, you know, there's real questions around whether it makes sense to try to do that within the same rate that's applied to customers' consumption, or whether it would be better to have a separate pricing mechanism, kind of like the value of solar concept, or the work that's going on in New York around the value of DERs.
Okay, and I think although we're past the hour, we've got a couple more questions, so we'll take that as an indication of interest, and we'll attempt to answer those. We're happy to see that level of interest, and of course we're also available for follow-up. If you download the report and want to ask more specific questions, we'd be happy to find time for those, maybe on a one-on-one basis. But there's a question here: is there a rate design and enabling technology that could incent customers to absorb energy, for example, in EV batteries or water heaters, that would avoid utility solar curtailment? My initial response, and I'm curious for thoughts from my co-authors, is in part, prior RMI research has looked at the implications of demand charges, in particular, on behind-the-meter consumption, behind-the-meter optimization. One implication we see of demand charges is potentially to really incent customers to manage their load behind the meter in a manner, whether it's through solar and the combination of load shifting and storage, to really reduce their draw on the grid and significantly reduce any demand charges that are imposed on them. So that's one way to think about demand charges.
Yeah, I would just add that, I think that there are opportunities to do that probably under a lot of different types of rates here, including both demand charges and time-based rates. If you are charging your battery or your EV and discharging at a time when you're paying a peak price, that is really an opportunity for energy arbitrage that you can engage in. I would also just refer folks on this question in particular back to the report that Dan mentioned at the beginning, The Economics of Demand Flexibility, which is a great report that looks in detail at just this question. So I think that might be a wrap in terms of questions and this discussion. Again, thank you all for taking the time and joining this presentation. We are more than happy to continue the conversation. Our emails are here. They're also in the report if you download that. So please feel free to reach out to us with additional questions and thoughts on this. We really hope that this can be an ongoing conversation in the industry. All right, I think that's it. Thank you, everybody, and we hope to see you again soon at the next eLab webinar.